Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Darren Fogarty, and I'm a researcher at the Institute. Before we begin today's Frankel Fiduciary Prize program honoring Ron Rhoades, the 2020 recipient, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, if you are not speaking in the first half of the program, we ask that you keep your microphones muted and your webcams off so that we may focus on the speaker at hand. Second, we remind panelists giving their remarks later in the program that you should only unmute yourself and show your webcam while you are speaking. And lastly, if you have any questions or comments, please send them in the chat so that we may answer them at an appropriate time. There will be time for Q&A. With those items out of the way, I will now give the floor to Knut Rhoades, President of the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard.
Thank you, Darren, and welcome to everyone. I am Knut Rhoades, President of the Institute. I'm glad that so many of you are joining this program to honor Ron Rhoades, our 2020 Frankel Fiduciary Prize honoree. In the next couple minutes, I will introduce the Institute and one of our speakers on this panel, and then turn the mic over to Ron, who is the first speaker on this panel. The Institute exists to advance fiduciary principles and practices in investment advice and financial planning through advocacy, education, and research. We were formed as a nonprofit in 2011. In accordance with our mission, the Institute established the Frankel Fiduciary Prize in 2013 to honor individuals who advance fiduciary principles in the public arena. The prize is named after Professor Tamar Frankel, Professor Law Emerita, Boston University. Professor Frankel is joining us today on this webinar. The chair of the selection committee, Professor Deborah DeMott from Duke Law, will speak on the prize a little bit later in the program. Today's panel is part of an annual program, Fiduciary September, which we established in 2012. Fiduciary September is exclusively sponsored by TD Ameritrade Institutional. So thank you, TD, for your support. Today's panel topic, fiduciary advice, where do we go from here, derives from the historic moment that is 2020, the moment when the 40 Act effectively passed in the SEC rulemaking. And unfortunately, ERISA is quickly following suit under the current administration. These developments present the question of where do we go from here as fiduciary advocates. Our speakers today on the panel are our prize honoree of 2020, Ron Rhoades, and our prize honoree from 2017, Barb Roper. We'll hold off on introducing Ron. We're going to save a lot of that for other speakers later on in the program. But Barb Roper has served the Consumer Federation of America since 1986. I'm not sure whether that's a typo or whether she started in grammar school, but whatever it is, she has been at this endeavor longer than probably anyone. When we honored her in 2017, I remember the CFA giving me a letter that she signed to then Chairman Arthur Levitt from 1999 as her first delving into this matter. So we can say with significant confidence that there is no one that is more experienced in this arena of fiduciary advice and regulation. So with that short introduction to the Institute and the panel, I would like to pass the microphone over to our honoree, Ron Rhoades. Ron?
Thank you, Knut. Well, I'm pleased to be able to offer some initial comments. Just this year, we've seen the SEC finalize its interpretation of the Advisors Act fiduciary duties and implement regulation best interest. And we've seen the Department of Labor propose rules that essentially would gut the fiduciary standard as it's found under ERISA. No doubt these are disturbing developments as the influence of broker-dealers and insurance companies over government agencies seems to have reached new heights. Cherished principles and established legal precedents have fallen to the whims of those who seek to accommodate Wall Street under the false mantra of consumer choice, rather than protecting individual investors. Recent rulemakings also deter the proper functioning of our capital markets, making them less efficient in the allocation of capital. So please permit me to share some thoughts on the current status of the fiduciary standard. And following same, I suggest a series of questions that policymakers might be asking regarding financial services and reforms as we hopefully move forward toward emerging from this pandemic. 6 decades ago, Fred Shred wrote his classic book, Where Are the Customer's Yachts? Yet just a few years ago, I took a group of my college students on a visit to a large broker-dealer firm, and I found myself in offices near the top floors of this magnificently tall building overlooking the Hudson in lower Manhattan. As I looked down, I saw many of the yachts parked in the adjacent harbor. The host of our visit approached me and proudly proclaimed that these yachts belonged to many of the brokers who worked in the building. In more than 60 years, it seems that little has changed since Fred Shred wrote his book. We are at a crossroads in terms of the application of the fiduciary standard to the delivery of financial and investment advice. Many insights have been developed over the past decades, especially over the last few, regarding what the fiduciary standard is all about. Yet, a lot of work remains to be done. We've seen regulators in recent years try to adapt the fiduciary standard of conduct to the current business models of Wall Street and the insurance companies. But predictably, their efforts have failed. You just can't chip away at the fiduciary standard. Just a few chips and the fiduciary standard loses its structure and just collapses into a pile of goo. There's a simple truth out there. No person can serve two masters. You can't be a trusted advisor, bound by a fiduciary duty of loyalty to your client, and also push proprietary or expensive products. The roles of the seller's representative, also known as a product distributor, and the purchaser's representative, also known as a fiduciary, are simply incompatible. Nor is the fiduciary standard observed properly by mere disclosure when a conflict of interest is present. Disclosures are ineffective, as confirmed by a large body of jurisprudence, as well as more recent academic research into the behavioral biases that both consumers and their advisors possess. We also know that this from our own collective practical experience as financial advisors. Consumers don't read disclosures, and those few that do simply do not understand the complexities of the modern capital markets to the extent that they can understand what is being disclosed to them. Because of this ineffectiveness of disclosures, the law imposes upon those who provide financial investment advice when they're in a relationship of trust and confidence, tough requirements to be an expert. In other words, to adhere to the fiduciary duty of care, and to be bound to act in the best interest of the client. In other words, with a fiduciary duty of loyalty. So when a conflict of interest is present, we are asked to not just make disclosure of the conflict and achieve understanding by the client, but the client must also provide informed consent to be harmed. We know, however, through extensive academic research, that the greater the fees and cost of an investment product, the lower the returns, especially over the long term, all other things being equal. The result is that the existence of a conflict of interest in the delivery of investment advice, at least where the advisor receives additional compensation for recommending one security over another, harms the investor. Fiduciaries must therefore undertake a cost-benefit analysis when applying their expertise in the selection of investment products. Higher cost products are not easily justified, nor is the differential compensation that often flows from pushing proprietary or other products. Why? Because no client would ever provide informed consent to an investment destined to produce lower returns for that client. Judges would never accept the proposition that clients are so gratuitous toward their financial advisors. Additionally, the law tests the treatment of the client so that the transaction is deemed to be substantively fair. These legal principles, informed consent and substantive fairness, substantially limit the application of waiver and estoppel to fiduciary relationships. It is inevitable that, in applying the best interest fiduciary standard of conduct, most conflicts of interest must be avoided. And to avoid the intense scrutiny of a fiduciary standard, the compensation provided to an advisor should be reasonable and should not vary based on the product recommendation made. The fiduciary standard therefore operates as a limitation of choice. It serves to eliminate bad choices and promotes the best investment choices. In so doing, the fiduciary standard counters opportunism and greed. Let me now turn to suggest some topics for further exploration in public policy circles. We know that a bona fide fiduciary standard of conduct is tough to adhere to. We need to design regulatory structures that better fit the fiduciary standard rather than seek to adapt the fiduciary standard to fit current conflict-ridden business structures. To that end, I think it's worthwhile to ask a great many questions as we look toward the future. First, by what grant of authority did the SEC possess to change the English language? The term best interest has been utilized in over 900 judicial decisions in the United States as an expression of the fiduciary duty of loyalty. The SEC's Reg BI, which by the SEC's own admission is not a fiduciary standard of conduct, is inherently misleading by its virtual title. To promote oneself as acting in one's best interest, in essence as a fiduciary, while not being a trusted advisor and merely acting as a product salesperson, is tantamount to fraud. Second, how can we and how fast can we correct the SEC's flawed interpretation of the fiduciary standard of the Advisors Act? How can we point out that estoppel and waiver possess very limited application to fiduciary client relationships? Third, can we return to the principle that once a fiduciary relationship is established with the client, the fiduciary duties apply to all aspects of that business relationship? There should be no more taking off of the fiduciary hat nor switching of hats. Fourth, in what universe is ERISA's strong trust law-based fiduciary standard and ERISA's prohibited transaction rules reduced to a disclosure-only regime, as the DOL recently proposed in its rule? Where did the DOL get the authority to simply ignore ERISA's statutory language? Fifth, we must ask, should all investment in financial advisors be bound by a bona fide fiduciary standard of conduct? The state of Massachusetts has taken this approach recently, accepting only insurance agents, and some other countries have taken a similar approach. If this were done, however, here in the United States, monumental changes would be needed in the securities and insurance industries. To provide truly objective advice, one might mandate via law or some other type of legislation or rules that fiduciaries must be separate and apart from manufacturers and product distributors. But this would dismantle many of the structures that have evolved in the broker-dealer and RIA firms associated with them and associated with mutual fund companies. Would such a sea change be justified? Are the benefits of a bona fide fiduciary standard to our society and to our economy so profound that we can justify the elimination of many of the business structures that exist in firms both large and small? Sixth, should we not insist at the very minimum that brokers not disguise the nature of their merchandising services through the use of titles that denote relationships of trust and confidence? Should we not further insist that the solely incidental exemption from the application of the Advisors Act to broker-dealers be modified so that when a relationship of trust and confidence is formed between a broker and his or her customer, that broker becomes subject to the requirements of the Advisors Act as well? Or should we take a completely different regulatory approach? Should we instead just seek to distinguish fiduciaries from non-fiduciary advisors? In other words, should we, through carefully crafted and mandated disclosure forms, provide consumers with knowledge of the status of their advisor. Consumers might be informed, for example, that they are dealing with a trusted fiduciary upon whom they can rely. Or it could be made clear to the consumer that they are dealing with some type of restricted advisor, one who is not a fiduciary, upon whom reliance cannot be placed, and who may in fact offer a limited range of products or proprietary products. We need to explore the MIFID regulatory structure put in place in Europe that did something similar and ascertain the extent of its effectiveness. And we should look to recent reforms that have been put in place in the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and other countries for inspiration to ascertain the effectiveness of such regulatory efforts. There are many more specific regulatory actions that should be considered to reduce conflicts of interest in financial services, regardless of the application of the fiduciary standard. For example, Bernie Madoff first developed the practice of payment for order flow. Should we now not recognize that payment for order flow is fundamentally a challenge to a broker's duty of best execution? Should we acknowledge finally that many 12b1 fees are simply advisory fees and drag? If we do keep 12b1 fees, should tax law be reformed so that commissions are not added to the cost basis of security and 12b1 fees are treated as taxable distributions to the owner of the mutual fund? Should we ban payment for shelf space? Should we also ban asset managers' payment for educational sessions at industry conference, payment of marketing support dollars, and all these other hidden forms of compensation? Shouldn't all investment and insurance products compete on their merits rather than on the basis of how much compensation is paid to the product's distributor? I also question why any investment advisor should generate revenue for themselves from the cash holdings of their client. Should not the client's cash be invested in the best vehicles possible? Finally, I'd like to turn my attention to FINRA. In 1941, FINRA acknowledged in its own newsletter that brokers can possess a fiduciary duty to their clients when a relationship of trust and confidence is present. But this acknowledgement is still not reflected nearly 80 years later in FINRA's own rules. Senator Maloney believed that NASD, which of course now has become FINRA, would raise the standards of conduct of brokers to professional levels. Yet at every turn, FINRA has opposed raising standards of conduct. I ask, is it not time to admit that FINRA's model of self-regulation is a gross failure? Is it not time to disband FINRA and move market conduct regulation back to the SEC and to the states? Or are we going to endure another 8 decades where the standards of conduct for brokers make very little progress? Alternatively, should, at the minimum, Congress mandate a disclosure akin to what is seen on cigarette packages, such as member FINRA represents a significant risk to your financial health? I have many other questions relating to reforming retirement plans, enhancing the regulation of investment companies, changing the tax and regulatory treatment of life insurance and annuities, increasing the efficiency of public offerings, tax reform, and also reducing regulatory burdens. But my time is limited today, so those views will be published courtesy of Advisor Perspectives, hopefully within the next day or two. I do have a vision of the future where all financial and investment advisors are fiduciaries, trusted by the public, and where the demand for financial advice soars as trusted financial advisors grow. But there remains much work to be done to advancing the fiduciary cause and in pressing for common sense solutions to the many structural problems in the policies that hamper the growth of the U.S. economy and its fairness in allocating resources to all of our fellow citizens. This is important work, for we are entrusted with other people's money and entrusted with their lifelong financial needs, desires, and as well their hopes and dreams. Thank you. Thank you, Knut.
Thank you, Ron. Very nice remarks. Let me, before I hand the mic over to Bart, one housekeeping notion. We have several reporters that are on the line. If you have a question for either of any of the panelists, when we're done, please put them in the chat box and I will pass them along. So with that housekeeping matter, Barb, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Knut. And thanks, Ron, for providing such a outstanding introduction to the topic and such a clear illustration of why we're, in the year that the SEC implemented Reg BI, we're still asking, where do we go from here? And I wanted to look at that under a couple of different scenarios. Because I think the election results will obviously have a huge impact on how we answer that question. And I assume, for example, that if President Trump is reelected, there will not be an opportunity at the federal level to fix the standard. Indeed, we'll see the reach of the standard extended to the Department of Labor rules under ERISA. And this significant watering down of retirement plan protections will become a fait accompli. I do think we have two options in that environment to try to advance the cause. Neither of them perfect. The first is we can pursue state laws. We can look to the states to try to advance their own stronger protections. It's not perfect. I think all of us would prefer a strong uniform federal standard, but if we're not going to get a strong uniform federal standard or even a uniform standard under the securities laws for advice provided by brokers and advisors, then I think it's reasonable to look to the states to try to fill that gap. And then the other option is simply to do what we can to educate investors on how to find those professionals who voluntarily adhere to a true fiduciary standard and minimize the conflicts of interest in their business model. And the good news there is that they're out there. The bad news is anything that relies on investor education is a heavy lift in terms of having a significant impact. So alternatively, let's assume that Joe Biden is elected president in November and appoints a reasonably progressive chair at the SEC to go along with the two outstanding Democratic commissioners we already have at the SEC in Allison Herron-Lee and Carolyn Crenshaw. And we now have an opportunity at the SEC to fix this standard. So I think the first question that sort of presents itself is it best to scrap Reg BI entirely and start from scratch, presumably using the rulemaking authority that Congress provided in Section 913G of the Dodd-Frank Act to create a uniform fiduciary standard for brokers and advisors? Or is there enough of a framework under Reg BI that we could use with changes to provide meaningfully improved protections for investors? And depending on what mood I'm in, I can make a kind of compelling case for either approach. The benefit, I think, of the latter option of trying to build on what exists is that it can be accomplished arguably more quickly, although it's not an overnight task, and with less regulatory red tape. So regardless of sort of which approach we take, what is it that we're trying to fix here? And I think that's, for me, starts with, at the most basic level, if we're going to have this best interest standard for brokers, we probably ought to define what we mean, because right now under Reg BI, you meet your best interest obligation by exercising care to make recommendations in the best interest of your client, and nobody knows what that means, and the SEC certainly isn't telling us. So we need a principles-based definition of best interest. Something along the lines that we've talked about is you have to have a reasonable basis for believing that the investments or investment strategies or services or accounts that you're recommending are the best match for the investor from among those you have reasonably available to recommend. And while there will often not be a single best option, the universe of products and strategies and it's whatnot that satisfy that best interest standard ought to be a lot smaller than the universe that satisfies a suitability standard. So even if we got that improved got that definition, that have to be improved just to exist, right? I think there's still a problem that we're likely to see very timid enforcement from the SEC. A reluctance to second guess brokers when they argue that they did something because they thought it was in the best interest of the customer. So in addition to that definition, what I really like to see us do is finally get serious about going after the incentives. And we have, I think, two tools for doing that. The first is the language that exists in the Reg BI, which requires brokers to have policies and procedures in place to mitigate conflicts of interest that are reasonably designed. But the SEC, again, has not told us how it will judge whether these policies and procedures are reasonably designed to mitigate those conflicts. And I think there's a potential, and what I've seen recently looking at disclosures is language that looks something like, we mitigate conflicts through a combination of training, supervision, and disclosure. In other words, exactly what we were doing before the regulation was adopted, with a few unreadable disclosures thrown in. So mitigate, what we need is mitigation that is reasonably designed to prevent the conflict from influencing the recommendation. And if we got serious about that, we might be able to make some headway. The other tool that is often overlooked is the language in 913G. It's the language the SEC used to ban non-existent product-specific time-limited sales contests of the broker-dealer business model, but that directs the SEC to review incentives and compensation practices that exist in both the broker-dealer and investment advisor business models, and authorizes them to either limit or ban those practices that they find to be inconsistent with the public interest and the best interest of investors. And so Ron went through what some of those incentives are that we might look to go after. The benefit of this is, one of the things I like about that authority is it gives us a way to go after the conflicts we're increasingly seeing in the fee accounts at dual registrant firms. And, really, where the fiduciary duty just isn't, a principles-based fiduciary duty just isn't equipped to work with those kinds of complex, opaque conflicts that can't adequately be addressed through disclosure. So that is something I liked about that aspect of the language in 913G. I also think it works well as a practical matter for the SEC to go in, make clear that it's going to be going in and looking what firms are actually doing as a practical matter to address their conflicts as the starting point for figuring out where they're going to limit and where they're going to ban, and then really get serious about reining in these incentives that encourage and reward advice that's not in the customer's best interest. And then, the other thing I'd like to fix, I'll just mention it, is the monitoring requirement. The SEC explicitly stated that brokers have no obligation to monitor customer accounts. That to me needs to be fixed. And I'm not talking about putting in place something that is identical to what exists when you have continuous ongoing investment advice, but there should be a duty to monitor that's commensurate with that functional role of providing episodic or periodic advice. So I'll stop there as just a sort of idea of how I would try to sort of begin that kind of campaign in a new administration to get us someplace that would meaningfully improve protections for investors. It might not be perfect, but it would be, raise the bar over where we are there. So I turn it over to you, Knut.
Thank you, Barb. As usual, very well said. I'm just going to take 3 or 4 minutes to, as it turns out, to sort of add on a little bit of what Barb says, and also focus a little bit more on where we are today for the purpose of sort of recognizing how far we've gone backwards. I think whether it's an organization or a company or whatever, the first step should be a sober view of exactly where we are today. The first point to me is, I think, is to follow up what Barb said about the opportunities with the state regulators. On an individual basis, we obviously see several states pursuing legislation on their own, and they're at different phases right now. Massachusetts seems to be in the lead, but on a collective basis, the opportunity to leverage the leadership of the state regulators, of NASA in doing what we hope will be done at the federal level, but we have reason to be skeptical that it will be done in terms of enforcing Reg BI the way it should be enforced. So I think that is a key issue. But starting with sort of where we are today, and sort of realizing how deep the hole is. You know, I speak of the SEC effectively repealing the 40 Act for retailer investors, and the DOL is on course to follow a parallel road, shall we say. The SEC's Form CRS officially seeks to erase perceived core differences between advisors and brokers without actually erasing any of this. So, and then following right on that, you know, to recall how the 40 Act was enacted, it should be thought of as the equivalent of the Civil Rights Bill for investors of its time, and now it's essentially gone. Gone is the idea that sales and advice should be regulated separately, and conflict should be avoided at all costs. Gone, as Ron refers to, are just basic common sense meanings of words. So today we have best interest, required mitigation, and fee disclosure simply do not mean what the words that they say they mean in the world according to the SEC. Further, choice is the newest pillar of fiduciary law. I don't recall reading Tamar's writings on this, where she has expounded on the fiduciary principle of choice, but that is now there based on what has happened. And today this narrative goes as a result that conflicts benefit investors, brokers, and advisors are basically the same. And today disclosure is the cure-all for investor protection. Basically what we've seen is a solid degradation of 40 Act principles through these spurious arguments. The transformation came about because of dogged BD broker-dealer advocacy founded on these arguments. Despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, these arguments reject law and logic and come with a high price. The Institute papers have noted the SEC's roundtable discussions with investors by the research by Climate Communications for ARP, and suggest the agency's language based on these arguments simply do not make sense to investors. So we suggest that the crux of the problem here was not confused investors as much it was confusing communications. I think this is a point that becomes relevant in a number of contexts when we start looking for cures, in a sense, because too often it appears that the core rationale for confusion is because investors simply are not smart enough. And I think that misstates the reality of what some of this research is telling us. I'd like to sort of leave on a moment also that the Institute is in the midst of some new research. I'd like to share a little bit with you regarding how independent advisors or fee-only advisors are reacting to, at least it appears, to what they're seeing in terms of what they are doing in holding out as fiduciaries or fee only. And I think where this comes into play is the core issue of this, the degree to which the SEC has succeeded in convincing investors that there's not a dime's worth of difference between brokers and advisors. So just as a quick highlight, we've looked at 45 fee-only investment advisor firms from the Investment News database and just looked at their websites to see what's written on there. And a little bit surprising that of those 45 firms, and they range in size from 20 billion to 350 million, we found that only 14 of these firms mentioned fiduciary on its home site web page. Only 14 of the 45. Now, inside the website somewhere, 33 of the firms also mention it, but on the homepage, only 33 do. And specifically, it's interesting that the larger firms have most eagerly sort of abandoned this branding. We only looked at 10 of the largest firms over 10 billion, but there are not that many more, in that category. And of those 10, only 2 use the word fiduciary on their home page, while at the other end of the spectrum, 8 of the 15, the smallest firms did use the term. And 11 of the 45 firms that we looked at, we could not find the word fiduciary in the website at all. Now, the qualification there is we didn't look at every single page, but on the obvious pages, we couldn't find it. So this tells us something, I think, about how the market is reacting to perhaps what we've seen in the regulation in terms of trying to erase the significance of fiduciary. But 3 concluding points here. The harms inflicted over the last 10 years to language and to law and to logic are real, and sometimes I think they are overlooked or not fully appreciated. And that while Ron is absolutely right, we need longer term fixes, we also can't lose sight of the shorter term opportunities to play defense, frankly, and try to create some tax that can help investors in the shorter term. And then, one example that we have talked about is, frankly, is introducing what is essentially a 2-page agreement at the point of sale or recommendation that is on paper and that highlights the products, the costs, and the conflicts as a new standard. It's not fiduciary in nature, but in terms of defending against bad actors and bad practices, I think it can be very helpful. So that is just one example. Finally, Ron Rhoades does note exactly correct. This is a long-term effort. Keeping the fiduciary standard is not a short-term task. It's more along with what we remember learning in high school, I hope, or grammar school, about when Ben Franklin told us about what it meant to have a republic. I think the same point is here. The 40 Act was a civil rights piece of legislation for investors, and I think it's time that we go back and we renew it in 2020. So, with those remarks, I will stop and open the floor to any questions we have. And the first one that comes in, I have a question from Melanie Waddell, and that is to any of the panelists. What are you hoping is covered during the upcoming Reg BI Forum CRS Roundtable, which is scheduled for October 26th? Barb, Ron, you want to take a stab at that?
I'll let Barb answer that one.
Sure. So I'll say what I hope is covered rather than what I expect to be covered. Like, ideally, the SEC should be doing what the states have already started to do, which is go in as a very practical and detailed way and look at what's happening inside the firms as they implement Reg BI. how specifically are they mitigating conflicts of interest present in their business model, identifying and mitigating those conflicts. What are they doing to ensure that they don't influence recommendations? How are they reaching a determination that their recommendations are in the best interest of the investor? Is there some meaningful analysis that's behind the recommendations that is different from what was occurring under your basic know your customer suitability standards? So that would be the key thing I'd want to look for. The other thing is the form CRS is a mess. You know, I don't know how many of you've looked at. I've looked at enough to know that most of them, except for the very simple sort of clean fee-only firms, they're mostly unreadable. You know, there's so much packed into 4 pages. No one's going to look at the document. And if they do, I think, I can't remember whether it was Knut or Ron, or maybe both of you made this point, the disclosures actually serve to obscure rather than clarify important differences in the standards. So they help to mislead the investor. And that would be the one correction I'd make to what you said, Knut. The problem isn't that the investors are being confused. The problem is the investors are being misled, and the SEC permits that kind of misleading communication. So I would like the SEC to look at, and they might also want to cover the reporting that Jason Zwine did in the Wall Street Journal, which showed that firms aren't even getting something as basic as their disclosures about their disciplinary record right. Like, that's not a big lift. If they're not getting that right, what else do you think is wrong there? And I'd love to think that the SEC was actually testing the disclosures they've mandated to see if any sort of reasonable investor could understand them, because I've read enough of them to assure you that they cannot. And if they reach that conclusion that the disclosures are understandable, I'd like to hear them discuss what they might want to do about that. I don't really expect any of that to be addressed in any serious way at the SEC.
I would just add, FINRA has indicated that it's going to come out with some type of interpretation of Reg BI. I don't know if it will happen by that time of that roundtable. So basically, I have zero expectations of the roundtable, and the only expectation I might have regarding FINRA is that it does its best to gut Reg BI further and basically make it what it is already, which is a meaningless standard that's nothing more than suitability plus some disclosures and misleading statements that nobody understands.
Thank you, Ron and Barb. We just got a couple more minutes left. We have the next question from Chris Carosa, who asked, to what extent can we rely on the marketplace to enforce a de facto fiduciary standard rather than hoping that regulators do it, eventually do so? I'm going to take a quick stab at that, because I have mentioned that there are I think developments in the marketplace that are actually encouraging, and I don't think of it so much as per se enforcing a fiduciary standard, except for those private advisor groups that actually put forward practices and standards and have some sort of mechanism for enforcing them. I'll take my 6 seconds here and say, such as the Institute for the Fiduciary Standard does, and now I'll stop. So that can certainly be helpful. But I mean, but one thing that I look at is maybe these are defensive measures that prevent worse conduct, as opposed to offensive measures like spreading fiduciary care. And one thing that I think of, frankly, is robo-advice, and the extent to which millennials particularly have moved in that direction. I think there's a case that is a defensive mechanism that can reduce opportunities for abuse. And no approach is perfect, but actually I don't like saying that, because that brings back Mary Poppins, and that's not what we're talking about here. But I think that's an example. I think also, and frankly, in terms of being optimistic going forward, we can look to millennials, and they have a very different attitudes about this issue of advice and about trust and things like that are very different from their from their parents' generation, which is helpful. So those are two things that I think of in terms of thinking that the marketplace can be more helpful and moving us in that direction.
Can I just throw in a couple of comments on that quickly? So first of all, I think there are valuable things we can, market forces we can try to bring to bear, but I think it is naive to think the market is going to solve this problem. It hasn't solved this problem in decades. And one of the reasons it hasn't is because it can only work if you have an informed investor making knowledgeable decisions. And investors, as we said, are being actively misled by the practices, the way that brokers hold out, by the disclosures that the SEC requires to be provided. So I think there are valuable things. We will be looking, if the market is what we have to work with, we will be looking for ways to steer investors toward the many advisors who voluntarily adhere to a true fiduciary standard. But that gets a small portion of the population and leaves other most vulnerable investors exposed. So it may be all we have under circumstances. It's not good enough. It's not a solution.
I believe that it might be. May I interrupt?
Please do, Tamar.
Okay, I was listening and wondering, maybe the time has come for some investors and maybe also this institute to create another advisors of advisors. Where would you go? What kind of questions would you ask? It need not be theoretical. It can be very straightforward. If you define what conflicts are, if you define what the education is, in other words, what the advisors really know, and give them I think if this, maybe this institute or others, or they themselves, create a way in which they would suggest to the potential clients 4 questions, 5 questions. And if those questions are answered in this way, they will be contractual. If you violate them, then you will be sued. That may create an enforcement mechanism that is based on contract, not on the SEC, not on the, no regulator. Yes, we know exactly now. And Ron, you've done a marvelous job in creating the image. Yes, but contract is still available to give a real duty, for which if you give advice under these conditions and you put some money in your pocket under other conditions, okay, I still believe there would be courts who are going to say, you pay maybe double, just for understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar.
That is precisely what DOL did as part of their best interest contract exemption, and the industry went nuts, which is a testament to how effective that approach likely would have been.
Okay, let's have a business that enforces truth and trust.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Ron, for this panel. We've gone over a little bit, and for the next part of the program, but so I want to pivot right now and hand the microphone over to Deborah DeMott, who is going to start the next part of the program. So Deborah, if you're ready to go, the microphone, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Knut. And thanks to everyone for joining us as we acknowledge the accomplishments of this year's recipient of the Frankel Fiduciary Prize, Professor Ron A. Rhoades. I chair the selection committee for the Institute, and I'd like to take this occasion to thank my colleagues on the committee for their work. Annually, the prize is awarded to recognize an individual with significant contributions to the advancement of fiduciary principles and advancement in public life. Prior awardees come from many walks of life, but share some common traits among themselves and very much with Professor Frankel, for whom the prize is named. Let me mention three of these common traits. One is an unswervable focus on the fiduciary values of loyalty, integrity, honesty, and diligence. The second is remarkable persistence over time. As we've seen, could be a very long time, as the prior panel illustrated. And the third is extensive influence on the ground on others to the good. I say there are differences, many differences among our awardees, but I think these traits are shared in common. Several of the prior awardees are with us today, including Barbara Roper, who spoke so well on the prior panel. We'll also hear from Phyllis Borzi and Harold Davinsky, both distinguished prior recipients of the prize. We're also fortunate to have the Honorable Luis Aguilar, a much admired prior commissioner of the SEC, and the Institute's president, Knut Rostand. We'll also hear from Ron's departmental chair, Dr. Inda Chachi, and a former student, Elijah Essa. But leading us off, and how wonderful, will be Professor Tamar Frankel herself, a mentor and ongoing inspiration to so many of us. And of course, we'll hear from Ron Rhoades himself with concluding remarks. So I believe the Institute's Darren Fogarty will lead us through this agenda.
Aye.
Hello there. Well, first we're going to have Tamar Frankel speak again. So I'll give it over to Tamar.
Thank you. I want to say a few words about Professor Ron Rhoades. He has been a significant contributor to the understanding and enforcement of fiduciary law and duties. Unlike many other legal areas, fiduciary law can be closely related not only to law, but also to national and group culture and many crucial services to humans, such as law and medicine. So the gray areas are abundant in determining where honesty crosses the gray shady line towards dishonesty, when the effective parties are unable, or affected parties are unable to detect and control the movement, and when, and often, that is the result of devastating results. So like the related concept of honesty, fiduciary concept is open to shades of possibilities. And in addition, fiduciary concept depends not only on the fiduciary, but also on the nature of the beneficiaries and others who are affected by the practices. So in some it is difficult to define fiduciary concepts and rules with specificity and enforce them. Professor Ron Rhoades is a prolific scholar, and his writing include path-breaking analysis and directives concerning these fiduciary relationships, in addition to the theories analysis, he has paved a way to a combined examination of both theory and practice in the past, in the present, and also in the future. In addition to the theoretical analysis, in this approach has enriched the theory and the practice. Moreover, in these unique, difficult times, his combined theoretical, realistic approach and the theory have contributed to guide this important legal area. I'm honored to have Professor Rhoades as my colleague and the recipient of the Frankel Award. Thank you.
All right. Next, we will have Knut Rhoades, President of the Institute.
Thank you, Darren. And thank you, Deborah, for your great introduction of the Frankel Fiduciary Prize and our speakers. And thank you for your leadership of the selection committee. With what has transpired with the SEC and DOL in 2020, we are living in historic times. There can be no question. Ron Rhoades has been in the trenches leading the fight for financial planning becoming a profession and against the assault on fiduciary principles investors for over a decade. I can think of no other person who has better represented fiduciary principles and the interests of investors so broadly through his research, comment letters, advocacy, and teaching. And teaching not just in his classroom, but teaching in the offices of regulators and policymakers. If you wonder if this is over the top, I suggest you ask SEC commissioners and DOL leaders whether this is so, or Hill staff, or advisor leaders, or journalists, or fiduciary advocates. Just by chance, we have 5 of those 6 groups represented on this webinar today. If you still wonder, I suggest you look at his CV. And I have in my hands a copy of his CV updated as of September 8th. So it's not something that's been in the files for a dozen years. His wide-ranging services to colleges, advisor groups, his extensive and ongoing presentations, his writings and publications, his citations in leading financial publications and other media. Ron's reach is broad, it's deep, and is pervasive. When I look at his CV, I am reminded of actually the motto of an independent school I attended when I was in 5th grade. And that motto was life through service. And this is the poster child for that motto from what you can see that Ron has done. And finally, for a clue as to what else is Ron Rhoades other than such a huge figure in the work he's done for fiduciary duties, I suggest you also look at his CV. I'm sure before you know it, it's going to be out on Facebook and everybody will be able to see it, Ron. And you look under the category of other positions. And Ron knows where I'm going with this. The only listing here is a half-page description of several positions Ron held as an undergraduate in Florida a few years ago, and where he worked as a student with one of the world's best known brands. Yes, that's right, it's Walt Disney World. But he wasn't crunching numbers in the executive suites wearing a pinstripe suit. That wasn't what Ron did. But he was he had several roles there, and those included being a supervisor and an entertainer. And among those roles, Ron was a performer in various shows, which included the characters of Goofy and the Big Bad Wolf. I mention this because this speaks of what is also Ron Rhoades that we could use a lot more of, particularly in the town where I'm based in called Washington, D.C., and that is humility and a little humor along the way. Imagine a justice in the Supreme Court having this on her CV. What would happen to that? But anyway, Ron, I am absolutely delighted that the committee has chosen you, and I think it's an excellent choice. So, Darren?
All right. Next, we will have Luis A. Aguilar, the former SEC commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission from 2008 to 2015.
Thank you, Darren, and good afternoon to everyone. Great panel, by the way. It's always an honor for me to follow Canute, but it's a particular privilege to be here today to congratulate Professor Rhoades on receiving the very prestigious Frankel Fiduciary Prize. I became intimately familiar with Professor Rhoades and his writings and research after I became a commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Although I was very familiar with the fiduciary standard long before I became a commissioner, it was the public discussion at the SEC about the differences between the fiduciary standard applicable to investment advisors and the suitability rule applicable to broker-dealers that required me to become much more familiar with those two standards. I needed to learn as much as I could. And that journey led me to the many writings of Professor Rhoades. Together with the writings of Professor Frankel, they were among the most informative discussions and explanations that I could find. The clarity, thoroughness, and common sense that flowed through and from those writings resonated with me as they have resonated with countless others. They were very well researched, eloquently written, and reliable as a source of information. Professor Rhoades' arguments were underpinned by sound and unassailable logic and by pragmatic common sense informed by hands-on experience. Professor Rhoades' consistent and eloquent voice on the benefits of fiduciary duty make him a truly worthy recipient of the Frankel Fiduciary Prize. Thank you for having me here today to add my voice in acknowledging Professor Rhoades and recognizing his valuable contributions. Congratulations, Ron, on a very well-earned award. You've had big shoes to fill, and I think you're filling them quite well. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Next, we will have Phyllis Borsey, the former Assistant Secretary of the Employee Benefit Security Administration at the Department of Labor from 2009 to 2017.
Thanks, Darren. I'm so happy to be able to offer my warm congratulations today to Professor Ron Rhoades on his selection as the 2020 winner of the Frankel Fiduciary Prize. Like my old friend, Professor Tamar Frankel, for whom this award is named, Ron has spent his career working for and writing about the need for a strong fiduciary standard to protect the legitimate expectations of investors that the people on whom they rely for financial advice deserve that position of trust. As you heard in his remarks today, he's passionate in his advocacy efforts to assure that these advisors are legally accountable as fiduciaries to put the interests of investors first above any financial interest that the advice giver may have in the investment strategy or product being recommended. And he's advocated for this accountability, not just in his work as a hands-on financial planner, but a frequent commentator and witness at numerous regulatory and congressional hearings in Washington, D.C., a master blogger. If you've never read his blog, go and read them, they're fabulous. And also a professor and mentor for students in his personal financial planning program at Western Kentucky University. His teaching skills were recently recognized by the university and his students when he received the 2020 Faculty Teaching Award. And as a former high school teacher and graduate student professor, the teaching award is the highest honor that your students can provide for you. And I commend Ron on that award as well. But also as a former regulator, I confess I always looked forward to reading Ron's comments. They were insightful, and I looked forward to examining his careful thoughts and analysis and his practical suggestions. There's no question in my mind that Ron's selection for the Frankel Fiduciary Prize is well deserved. Congratulations again, Ron.
Thank you, Phyllis. Next, we'll have Harold Ivinsky. He is the president of Ivinsky and Katz, which is a fee-only fiduciary advisory firm. Harold?
Back here. Although intimidated by following such an extraordinary group of people, I'm a practitioner, have been for probably 40 plus years. And in that time have been involved and met hundreds, if not thousands of other professionals. But Ron certainly is unique in that universe of those that I've had the privilege of working with. The three attributes that I understand are the criteria for the award: unswervable, persistent, and extensive influence. Don't even begin to describe Ron's influence in this area. The one other word that Professor Frankel brought up that occasionally has been kind of overwhelming for me is prolific. It's been difficult to keep up with everything that Ron writes, but as other commentators have said, it's always been worth it. It's been a privilege to know Ron and work with him, have him teach my classes on occasion, and I couldn't be more pleased with the honoree for this award. So Ron, congratulations.
Thank you, Harold. And next we'll have Dr. Indu Chachi, the chair of the Department of Finance at Western Kentucky University.
Hi, Darren. Having slight issues with my webcam. I'm going to go ahead and speak, although my webcam is not working, and I apologize for that. There has been a lot that has already been spoken about Ron and the role that he has played in the fiduciary space for years, if not decades. As a practicing financial planner and a passionate supporter of fiduciary standard, long before I met Ron, all I can say is that for the sake of an average investor, for the sake of the financial and retirement health of tens of millions of investors who seek well-intentioned help from advisors, I hope the fiduciary debate is settled once and for all so that no one has to ever wonder whether or not their advisor is a fiduciary, and every investor can be confident that the person sitting across the table is really on the same side of the table, so to speak. I want to devote my 2 minutes talking about Ron as a professor, as a colleague, and most importantly, as a teacher. I've had a long tenure as a department chair and can say without equivocation that Ron is the exact kind of professor you want to have in your department when you are the department chair. From day one, Ron has been more than willing to do what was needed to advance the department. He starts and ends from the student success perspective, and from that point on, it is simply a question of implementing what is needed. Our department had always taken pride in putting students first, but in the 5 years that Ron has been at WKU, we have been able to do exponentially more to help students succeed. The list of new initiatives that Ron has led at WKU is too long for me to enumerate, but all I can tell you is that before COVID, he was out there on the road taking students to visit firms from Nashville to Charlotte, from Atlanta to Louisville and beyond. He has been a major force behind the large increase in the number of students getting internships and job offers from firms such as Vanguard and Dimensional Fund Advisors and many more. Our job placement and CFP pass rates numbers have skyrocketed under his leadership of the program, but then that should not be a surprise to any of you. His classroom preparation assignments and expand your comfort zone assignments have become legendary in our hallways, and it's one of the reasons why he won this teaching award that was mentioned a few minutes ago. These assignments and approaches are literally changing student trajectories. In addition to his advocacy work, in many other ways, he continues to put WKU and our students on the national map. Finally, I want to close with this thought. Ron is not just a thinker and an idea man. He's much more than that. He's a doer. And that to me is a critical point. He's more than willing to put in the effort at whatever personal cost to ensure that the ideas are put into action. It is indeed a privilege and an honor to call Ron a colleague and a friend, and I look forward to working with him for many more years. Congratulations, Ron, on such a well-deserved honor.
Thank you for those glowing and personal remarks. And we're not done yet. We have Elijah Essa. He's a former student of Ron Rhoades and an investment advisor now at Coates Financial Planning. Elijah.
Thanks, Darren, and thank you, Dr. Chachi, for those wonderful words about Ron. My name is Elijah Issa. I currently work as a financial planner at a fee-only firm called Coates Financial Planning in Louisville, Kentucky. And I've been here for about 3 years, and I love what I do. But I wouldn't have chosen this career path had it not been for Ron Rhoades. Ron, or Dr. Rhoades, as we Western Kentucky folks call him, had recently begun teaching when I took his applied investments course as a junior. So I was a business finance major at the time, and I had internships within the corporate finance field, but kind of left more to be desired in terms of career satisfaction. I wasn't a big fan of the corporate infrastructure, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I'd considered becoming a financial planner in the past, but the whole sales stigma had deterred me from doing that because I am just not a salesman. So when I stepped into Dr. Rhoades' class for the first time, he was blaring 80s music from the classroom speakers, and I knew that it was not going to be a typical college course. It was also a very small course, only about 8 of us in the class, one of the smallest courses I've ever had, but also one of the most personal. So over the course of the semester, Dr. Rhoades enlightened all of us about how the financial planning industry is set up, including the good and the bad and the ugly. And he spoke about fee-only financial planning and the fiduciary standard for those types of planners. And it was very obvious that he was passionate about that side of the business, and that passion was contagious. It wasn't long before I started to reevaluate my career choice and made the transition to want to be a financial planner, with the caveat that I work at a fee-only firm and I couldn't see myself working any other way. After that, I took plenty of courses with Dr. Rhoades, had so many memorable experiences with him and my class cohort. And Dr. Rhoades actually also set me up with a local financial planner to give a tour of campus. And it turns out that that financial planner is now my employer. So I owe a lot to Dr. Rhoades, and fast forward into now, he prepared me for my day-to-day more than any other teacher I had, explained various financial planning topics in practical ways that translated well to the actual field. It wasn't just conceptual, but it was practical. And perhaps more importantly, Dr. Rhoades taught me to seize the moment and get out of my comfort zone. He stressed the importance of being kind to others and having confidence, which are arguably just as important as any financial topic I could have learned over the course of my college career. So all of this being said, Dr. Rhoades' influence in my career has been monumental. I'm very happy to see him deserve this or to receive this award, and I think it is well deserved. So thank you, Dr. Rhoades. Honor getting to know you over the past few years and for many years to come.
Thank you, Elijah.
All right, Ron, you can respond to some of that if you'd like. That's your time to talk now.
I will, and I'll try to keep it brief. Thank you all for such kind remarks. I'm grateful to all of you as well for your advocacy and support of best practices for serving investors. Let me begin by thanking the members of the selection committee, Professors Deborah DeMott and Robert Sitkoff, Attorney Michael Koffler, and my colleagues, Clark Blackman and Knut Rostad. I stand here at first amazed that these esteemed individuals would actually read my writings, which many of you know are at times not viewed as extraordinarily succinct. I am also humbled that as a recipient of the award, I would join the company of these great individuals who have accomplished so much, who are so well known, and who were prior recipients of the award. Professor John Langbein, Harold Avinsky, Barb Roper, Phyllis Borsey, David Swinson, Gary Gensler, and Robert Monks. It is truly an honor to share in their light in a small way. I'm honored by the presence of Luke Dean, whose ideas for engaging students with practitioners have tremendously aided me in my career as a professor. At this point, I'd like to further expound on the fiduciary standard by reading one of my 90-page comment letters to the SEC or the DOL, but don't worry, I won't subject you to that. If you have ever attempted to read any one of my long comment letters on the fiduciary standard, I just want to suggest that there are 6 individuals that you might want to blame. Harold Avinsky's presentation at a 2001 conference spurred me on to become an investment advisor and a fiduciary. Steve Johnson and Dan Morzan, 2 other pioneers of the fiduciary movement, actually encouraged me, if you can believe it, to get involved in public advocacy. Louis Aguilar actually suggested at one point that I become more forceful in my advocacy, and I hope, Louis, that you get nominated to become the next SEC chair. I hope you not only nominated, but would accept that. It'd be a great honor to have you there. In my very first meeting with Phyllis Borsey nearly a decade ago, I recall that she actually said, and she repeated it today, that she enjoyed reading my comment letter. Little did she know how that might encourage me. And Knut Rostad has convinced me to visit the DOL and SEC in Capitol Hill in recent years, more times than I can remember. Yes, these 6 individuals can be blamed for you today for any readings from me that you may have tackled. Having said all that, I must confess that some confusion at this time regarding the receipt of the Tamar Frankel Fiduciary Prize. Awards such as this are often received at the conclusion of one's career. I wonder if this award is an underhanded way of telling me, Ron, please don't write so much. Just, of course, I hope to remain involved in these public policy discussions for years to come. I hope to continue to provide what insights I can to supplement the fine work done by Barb Roper and the Consumer Federation of America, the Financial Planning Coalition, the Institute, and so many other groups who realize the importance of the adoption of true fiduciary standards. I thank my colleagues at the Institute for Fiduciary Standard for their important contributions in the advancement of the fiduciary standard over the past decade. And I express my deep appreciation to my colleagues within NAFA, whose fee-only requirement best demonstrates how the fiduciary standard should be applied. I have learned so much and benefited so much from my association with the outstanding professionals found within these organizations, as well as for my collaboration with the exceptional leaders of the profession found within the steering committee of the Committee for the Fiduciary Standard. I also wish to thank my department chair, Dr. Chachi, my colleagues, as well as my students in the Department of Finance, the Gordon Ford College of Business at Western Kentucky University, for their ongoing support that they have provided me for my efforts to address these important issues of policy. It has truly been a privilege to be associated with such a fine college of business. Lastly, I express my gratitude to my wife of 39 years, Kathy, who recently informed me that she would continue to be married to me, provided I did not ask her to read any more of my writings. Finally, I wish to again express my appreciation to Professor Tamar Frankel. Her writings laid the foundations for so much of what other academics and policymakers have developed since, and she continues her powerful advocacy. The truths about the fiduciary standard that she espoused over the course of her lifetime continue to be the truths that the rest of us follow today. Her life and her teachings are an inspiration to us all. So thank you very much for this award. Thank you, Knut. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Ron, for your eloquent and concise words just now. See there, we got a smile. In closing out this webinar, there is one piece of business that is yet to be done. And Darren, do you have something to show on the webinar?
Yeah, here we go.
Okay. And this follows up Ron's remark regarding Professor Frankel and her advocacy that has been so important to all of us. Just over 2 years ago, several leaders of the Institute were able to get a meeting with Chairman Jay Clayton. That was quite a meeting because at the center of the meeting, we had 3 of the larger than life names in Fiduciary. And I want to bring you into the chairman's conference room, which we couldn't take this picture, but I want to describe it. At the end of the conference table, of course, was the chairman himself. And then to his left, we placed none other than Professor Frankel. And to his right, we placed none other than Phyllis Borsey. So he was surrounded by smart, well-spoken women right then. And then booming overhead, who joined us by conference call, was Jack Bogle. And so this was our only meeting with the chairman. He did not invite us back, and I can't imagine why. But we have a little something for tomorrow that we waited too long to give her. But I wanted to show it quickly on the screen because it says so much about what Tamar has meant to us at the Institute. And so this is the picture taken outside the SEC because the chairman was in no mood to have us take a picture inside his conference room. I can tell you that for sure. So Tamar, on behalf of the board of the Institute, Jim Patrick, Michael Zerner, Paul Pagnato, and I want to give you our special thanks for what you have meant for us. And this small token, finally, I was hoping to get a time when we could actually do this in person, and that never came about. So here it is, the picture memorializing that day and that meeting. So thank you, Tamar, for everything that you've done for Fiduciary and for investors. That brings us to the close of this webinar. This is the first that we have done this, and I want to thank so much Darren for bringing this all together and making this happen and putting up with my nagging as we sort of approach this date. And thank the speakers and the panelists for joining. To be on a panel with Ron Rhoades and Barb Roper, the only other way I could justify is that we were looking for somebody whose last name began with an R, and so I was able to join. So that is a special meeting for me. And then all those who spoke on behalf of Ron or for Ron or about Ron, thank you very much. So on that note, unless there's any urgent comments or a critical comment that someone would like to add, I think we've come to the end of this webinar. Darren, are you seeing any requests to say something?
No, I don't. I think we should let Tamar speak since she has her photo now.
You have your photo. Put the photo up there. Honey. Show them you have the photo. Thank you so very much for the very wonderful letter you just received in the mail today, which you haven't read.
Oh my, I did not know that until this very minute. And If I don't prepare speeches, I am speechless. So in this case, double. But I want to tell you something. About 50 years ago, when I wrote an article of fiduciary law, I was told by one judge, I will not mention his name, you don't understand. Everything is contract. And I believed differently, but it took years and it took persuasion, but not mine. It's the idea itself that had the wings, and then it flew here, abroad, everywhere. And thank all of you, because that is what you made it real. Thanks a lot. And this, you gave me life. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar. All right, then on that perfect closing, our webinar is now complete, and thank you everyone for joining.